then let's get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This webinar will discuss the topic of food security in fragile and low-income countries, especially with regard to the war in Ukraine and the impact that this conflict has on global food security. So over the past months, I think we've all heard the words granary of the world plenty of times in the media, referring to both Ukraine and Russia, which I think is an indication of how pressing this issue already is and will probably also still develop to be. But yeah, what does this have to do with us? Why are we here today? I think maybe one of our panelists, Bram, is the best person to answer this question. Bram, you are an advisor on food security and food systems at Coordate, and also one of the initiators of this process. Could you maybe share briefly why you initiated this project?
Yeah, thanks, Larry, and hi everyone. I think it's indeed an important topic and an important time to be discussing these issues. Indeed, you see in the world that a lot of effects are generated by the conflict by the Russian war in Ukraine. There's increasingly warnings being shared by UN organizations on the issue of food insecurity in the world. You see the effects reverberating all around from Latin America to Africa to Asia. And one of the reasons we felt we wanted to explore scenarios is that we can't look into the future, but we can try to indeed imagine what the future could be beyond, for instance, the hectic day-to-day happening. So every day we see news coming out, every day we see new updates, and every time we're surprised more or less about what's happening. And the importance of scenarios is that we challenge ourselves to zoom out and try to see the bigger picture, and to also incorporate systemic thinking within our work, within our organizations, and the importance of seeing those global linkages, those global connectivities, which have an impact, especially on those areas where we're working in low and fragile income countries, where we're actually trying to focus on as humanitarian and development organizations.
Okay, thank you very much, Bram. And I think we'll hear more on the importance of scenario planning also later on in this webinar from Just and Herman. Well, before I hand it over to my co-moderator who will discuss today's program, let me first introduce myself. My name is Laurie Bolling. I am one of the moderators of this webinar today. I'm the intern at KUNO, which is the platform for knowledge exchange of the Dutch humanitarian sector. I've been part of this scenario planning process from the beginning, so I'm very excited to discuss the outcomes of it with all of you today. But Royan, will you take it over from here?
Yes, thanks, Laurie. So my name is Royan Bolling. So we're doing a little bit of a Bolling and Bolling co-production today. But while Laurie is at the KUNO, Knowledge Platform Humanitarian Exchange, I'm at the Netherlands Food Partnership, similar organization working on building, accelerating food systems transformation with the Dutch organizations and their partners in lower middle income countries. Peter, could you share the program on the screen, please, so I can go through it? There it goes already. So it's very, very fast. So what we'll have here today is, first we will have a presentation from Herman and Just at the Center of Wageningen, the Wageningen Center for Development Innovation. They have been guiding us in this scenario process development and have been writing up the documents that you have all seen, hopefully. And they will present it shortly for us before we enter into discussion. After their presentation, there will be a little bit of space to discuss the Mentimeter that is already launched. So please, if you haven't done so already, go to menti.com and maybe Peter can enter the code in the chat while I introduce the rest of the program. So then we will have Bram from Coordate, who just introduced himself already, that is discussing their perspective on these scenarios. And we will also hear from Elisa Stappiet. I hope I pronounced it correctly, which is a regional partnerships manager for Coordinate in Asia, and Evans Onyemara, who is Secretary General of the Christian Council of Nigeria, and also part of the ACT Alliance. So just so you know, if you are interacting in this program later on, the session is being recorded, and we aim to also publish an edited version of this on YouTube. So that is for your information. I also invite you during the presentations to interact with us via the chat. We only have a short session of an hour, so we really aim to also use the chat to interact with you during the presentation and during the discussion. And maybe to clarify, the goal of today's meeting is first of all to present these scenarios and also get some feedback from all kinds of people in the humanitarian and development sector on what potential actions for their organizations can be based on a scenario exercise like this. So that is why we ask you to think with us about, what opportunities do you see for your organization to prepare for the future, basically based on these scenarios. So before I hand over to Herman and Just to present the scenarios, that will also be the second Mentimeter question. So first, we have already introduced the Mentimeter. You can try it out while they present, but the next question, please remember, is also what opportunities do you see for your organization to prepare for the future? So listeners, please listen actively and think about that as well while Herman and Just introduce the scenarios. Please go ahead, Herman or Just.
Hello, everybody. My name is Herman Brouwer from Wageningen University Research, the Center of Development Innovation. And today we're happy to share with you the results of an interactive participatory process that we were able to work on together with all the agencies that are present here at the initiative of Coordinate and Kerk in Actie, and also supported by KUNO and the Netherlands Food Partnership. What I think Bram already underlined kind of the urgency of the question that we're discussing today around the impacts on food security in fragile context of the war. And of course, first and foremost, we acknowledged, of course, that that the impacts of the war are primarily at this moment felt in Ukraine itself, and we can already foresee that there will be, a substantial rehabilitation effort needed afterwards, and also lots of aid resources will probably be channeled towards that region. But of course, we are also thinking about the countries that are already fragile and that are very much dependent on some of the commodities in the global food market, such as wheat, barley, maize, sunflower oil. You can see from the graph here that Ukraine and Russia together supply quite a substantial part of some of these commodities. And we know that this has already led to quite a bit of uncertainty in global food markets. And therefore, also as part of this exercise, we reached out to many of the partners of the KUNO network. And we heard immediately stories about the rising prices of food, fertilizer, and fuel, or even the unavailability of fertilizer or any other inputs that you could directly relate to the war in Ukraine. So that's really, a substantial, unusual, serious issue that we have to prepare for and have to grapple with. So what we ended up doing was organize an exploratory scenario process. And there were about 8 humanitarian and development organizations who participated. So some of them were humanitarian NGOs, others were more on the development spectrum of humanitarian versus development. Some organizations were having a dual mandate and were doing both. So they, of course, were really, really interested to know, how can we prepare for this? Is there anything in this very uncertain situation that we can do to be a little bit more clever and deliberate about preparing our organizations to provide the best possible response for whatever the future holds? And what we ended up doing was organizing 3 workshops in April, where we together kind of defined and analyzed what are some of the key drivers and trends that we see as part of this as part of the food security in fragile countries as a result of the impact of the war in Ukraine. And from there, we developed 4 different scenarios, which I'll show to you in a minute. And we also looked at the impacts of these scenarios. Now, first of all, if you think that maybe today at this webinar, you will learn how the war will end or how hunger will develop in some fragile countries, well, this is the wrong webinar, I would say, because some of those answers to these questions just cannot be given. There's too much uncertainty and too much complexity in that. The reason why we think scenarios can be useful is that it is a methodology that you use precisely when there is complexity and uncertainty. But if there's too much uncertainty and complexity, then you just end up speculating. And that's, of course, you know, what everybody is doing, but that's not necessarily really a good way to inform your strategy and your tactics. But if, on the other hand, if there is not so much uncertainty and also it's not that complex, you can actually predict what's going to happen, right? So scenarios are in the sweet spot in between predictions and speculations. And as Bram already mentioned, we really use scenarios to stretch our own thinking and to imagine different futures. And we're talking here about futures in plural, because we're just exploring how the future could unfold in different ways and what the implications of that could be. Next slide. So you may have seen this from the documentation that KUNO has already shared with you. That's also available on the website. These are the scenarios that we ended up developing together. And as you can see, there are 2 axes. It's a 2x2 matrix. From the top to the bottom, you will see one big key uncertainty is how the conflict will evolve. Will it escalate or will it be contained in one way or another? And that will, of course, determine a lot about the issue of food security. And from the left to the right, you see another key uncertainty, which is the level of food system resilience in the countries that we're talking about. Is it going to be low, and will these countries have limited resilience, or will it be high? And you can see the pictures will speak for themselves. You can see in each scenario, there is like a market stall with a seller, and there are buyers there. And at the backdrop, you will see kind of the conflict, whether some emerging or subsiding. And that's the type of different futures, the 4 of them, that we'd like to discuss with you today. And I will ask my colleague Just Dengering to take over from here and talk us through the 4 scenarios.
Yes, thank you, Herman. So I will have the honor to show you a bit more about how these scenarios look like, what kind of impacts they might have for different types of stakeholders, and also what kind of implications these scenarios possibly have for humanitarian and development organization. And I will go through these scenarios one by one. Starting with the scenarios that we actually developed together with these humanitarian and development organizations in these workshops. We came to 4 different scenarios. And the first scenario we called global food crisis. So this is a situation where you have a combination of conflict escalation and low food system resilience. So in that scenario, together we envisioned this future. So this would be a future where you see continued conflict, driving food, fuel, and inputs to become unaffordable, really spiking it to high levels of food insecurity, leading also to social unrest, domestic conflicts, and that emergence of new conflicts also leads to growing number of refugee crises. So you see a combination of different crises developing in parallel and affecting each other. Then you have the scenario of forced adaptation. It's a scenario where you also have conflict escalation in Ukraine, but you have also high food system resilience. So you see that markets actually adjust to the shortages and food prices actually stabilize short term, because in other places of the world, more grain and vegetable oil gets produced. But if you look at the context of more fragile low-income countries, we see also a situation of stretched aid budgets, because of course the crisis in Ukraine is still going on and needs a lot of resources. And we see that there's a lot of pressure locally on food security still, also due to global instability in geopolitics, polarization of political and economic systems due to the ongoing Ukraine war. So this we call forced adaptation, because it's really a situation where countries can't do anything else than really adjust to this new reality. And within this scenario, they also have the capability to do that. Then we have a third scenario, which is called sensitive to shocks. So it's a situation where actually the conflict in Ukraine is contained, but you still have low food system resilience. So you see that food prices first stabilized due to the conflict containment in Ukraine. They are not that high anymore. But you see that food systems didn't really change or transform due to the conflict ending quite early. So the food systems remain highly sensitive to shocks. And that also means that there's a lot of impact which then can drive up prices again. So you can see a continued trend of what we have seen in the past 4 or 5 years, rising hunger and undernutrition levels, because shocks like from climate change, but also from conflict, keep on having a big impact on local food systems. And then you have a fourth scenario, and that we call ready for the future. So it's a scenario where you have this combination of conflict containment, but also high food system resilience. So you see that global and local food systems really adapt to that situation very quickly through diversification and building buffers, which really means that those food systems become much more resilient, which helps also to stabilize food prices in the long term, and also make sure that food security actually improves in fragile context and hunger and nutrition decreases. So this is, from all the scenarios, the most positive scenario. So now I want to take you shortly to what does it actually mean for different groups of stakeholders. And I'll do that based on 3 stories of different persons in low-income context. So we see the story of Omar, a rural farmer. In the situation of the global food crisis scenario, you see that he has low access to foods, has to deal with high input prices, doesn't have the incentives to invest in the farm and continue farming, also due to the high instability in that context. Then you have forced adaptation. In that scenario, he might be growing alternative grain or vegetable oil crops, but you see this continuation of high food prices because still the global context is a very unstable one. Then you have the scenario sensitive to shocks. You see that shocks like from climate change really still have a major impact on income, on investment, on food security. So even though the Ukraine conflict is contained, there's still a situation where a lot of topics need a lot of attention. And in the ready for the future scenario, Omar really goes into diversification of production, leading to sufficient income, to sufficient food security, and also that resilience against these shocks. Then we go to the story of Grace, an urban consumer. In the scenario of global food crisis, you really see those spiking expenses for food and for fuel. You see social unrest happening in the cities. In the scenario of forced adaptation, you see high fuel and food prices also, but You also see this change to more consumption of local food. So food systems really adapt also to that new reality, basically. Sensitive to shocks, you see limited access to local food, higher reliance on imported products, because the food security locally is much affected by different shocks to the system. And then ready for the future, that's really a situation where there's access to a diverse, affordable, and also local diet, where really that local resilience has been built. And then we have the story of Mariam, a policymaker. In that scenario of global food crisis, she really struggles from the government side to be able to provide even the most basic service to citizens. This is really a disaster scenario. In forced adaptation, you find this difficulty to be able to import affordable grain and vegetable oils because the conflict is still ongoing. Insensitive to shocks, you see this increasing reliance on foods imports of countries. And then ready for the future, it's more of a scenario where there is space and room for investment in more integrated food policy, really focusing on food system resilience. So these are some of the perspectives of what might happen to different stakeholders in different scenarios. And then I would like to close with a bit of a slide where I show you some of the possible implications for humanitarian and development organizations. But as discussed already, this is also something where we want to, in this webinar, also pick your brain about what you see as action perspectives for your organization, looking at these different scenarios. So in global food crisis, that scenario, it's really a disaster scenario. It's a scenario wherein humanitarian organizations really have to scale up the food aid and refugee assistance because the amounts of conflicts are spreading, the amount of food insecurity is rising very rapidly. Development organizations in this scenario really have to also shift some of their resources to really addressing that food crisis. So moving in their work more towards the humanitarian side. And the allocation of resources over a growing number of crises is a key challenge here. So how to spread resources over what's happening within Ukraine, what's happening in countries affected by food insecurity, affected by conflict, which is rising in this scenario. So it's really a difficult scenario to deal with for both humanitarian and development organizations. Then you have this scenario of forced adaptation. And that's a scenario where the world and geopolitics remain very unstable, where there's a lot of polarization. So this is also a scenario where it's really needed to focus on peace building and conflict de-escalation, because the polarized geopolitics might also result in conflicts elsewhere and regional spread of conflict to other regions. Development organizations in this scenario can support local food system resilience because in this scenario that is quite high. So local food systems adapt. They start to invest in local alternatives for grains and vegetable oils. And it's some of those examples you already see now, of course, happening in countries like Senegal. But it's also a scenario of polarization of geopolitics. So that's also puts that neutrality principle of the humanitarian sector really under pressure. Increasingly, people have to choose sides in an increasingly polarized world. Then we have the scenario sensitive to shocks, and we see that in this scenario, you really need to scale up that disaster risk reduction, really to increase that system resilience. So it's really making sure that in a situation where food system resilience is low, really finding ways to work on that. And it also means investments in climate adaptation, in agricultural diversification, to make sure that capacity is developed to strengthen local food systems. And then what could be interesting in this scenario is that that relatively short shock of the Ukraine war, which is contained in a quite early stage, can also be used as an argument or as a leverage point, let's say, to lobby for more resources for the humanitarian and development sector, and saying, okay, it's really needed to invest in that food system resilience in order for food systems not being so sensitive to these kind of shocks in the system, and really strengthening arguments for food system transformation as well. Now, then finally, we have the fourth scenario, ready for the future. And that's a scenario of conflict containment and high food system resilience. So there you have a lot more space as humanitarian and development organizations. You can shift more from relief to recovery interventions. You can work more on a broader development agenda, really paying a lot of attention to other topics, climate, gender, which are very urgent and important. And also room to invest in localization, really investing in local management and solutions, and really having attention and space for that agenda as well. So I want to leave it here. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts through the Mentimeter, but also later in the discussion. Yeah, thanks for being invited to this great webinar.
Thank you, Just, and also thank you, Herman, for this very clear presentation of both the process and the scenarios that we've developed. I think it's now time to have a quick look at the Mentimeter that we started in the beginning of this this webinar. Peter, if you could share. Yes, exactly. So here we see your answer to the question what your greatest area of concern is with regards to the consequences of the Ukraine war. Well, seeing the topic of this webinar, maybe it's not very surprising that we see global food security at the top of this list. But I see that conflict escalation of the war in Ukraine is also a big worry for the participants of this webinar. Yeah, so this is a very oh, you see it's still changing, so some people are still answering the question. What do you think, Royan? Are these results surprising to you, or do they align with your personal worries?
I think it makes a lot of sense that people are worried about global food insecurity and also about the conflict escalating. I would propose that we move on with the meeting, to conserve a little bit of time, but maybe we introduce our next question. So Peter, can you set up the next one, and then maybe people can answer those while we have the presentations of Coordate and our other guest, Elisa and Evans. And that question that we are asking you, I see that the screen has now stopped being shared, is actually what opportunities do you see for your own organization to prepare for the future? So actually, this is what the next panel will discuss, and I hope you think along with them. Enter that also in the Mentimeter, and then when we kick off the discussion in about 10 to 15 minutes, we shortly reflect on that before we start the interaction. So please go ahead, Bram. I believe you will tell us a little bit about how Coordate could use these scenarios and elaborate a bit about opportunities and threats that this presents. In the meantime, Just and Herman are answering questions in the chat about the presentations. Please do continue interacting in the chat as well.
Thanks, Royan, and thanks to Herman and Just for the presentation. I think the scenarios really show also indeed quite visually about very important dynamics that are currently taking place, and especially highlighting the medium to long-term consequences that we might foreseeably encounter in the future. So indeed also responding a bit to some of the questions being posed in the chat. So this is a little bit different than conducting an assessment of the situation on the ground. And of course, while those assessments are very important, we find it I think as Cordate as well as an organization, we find it interesting to also be able to link those to a wider perspective and to open up indeed channels of discussion, creative development of partnerships in order to sort of tackle and to contextualize these scenarios. Maybe from Cordate perspective, it's good to share that we are a dual mandated organization. So we work both in humanitarian context, we work as well in development context. A lot of our work revolves around fragility. So we work in a lot of fragile settings, such as Afghanistan, indeed Bangladesh, Iraq, South Sudan, but also countries that are indeed close to those fragile settings, where we work also on sort of the socio-economic development side. We work a lot with partners. So we are part of Caritas networks, we are part of ACT Alliance networks and CITS network, for instance, and many other local partners, where we work in a multi-stakeholder approach in these countries. And for us, these scenarios point in a number of directions. And I think many of us will be able to sort of work with these scenarios in terms of communication, raising awareness. What these scenarios tell is in fact a story that we want to communicate to policymakers, to donors, to other partners that we are working with, private sector, etc. That these scenarios matter and they will have effect globally. They will have effect on a lot of different development processes and also, for instance, the achievement of sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the first aspect that I think we can use these scenarios for. So really communicating and lobbying to raise awareness that we avoid negative futures and strive towards the future that we want to achieve. The second point is that it's important for us as an organization to work more on triple nexus programming. So it's about working on the interface of humanitarian development and peace programming, and also seeing where opportunities lie, where most urgent needs need to be met, but at the same time we feel that potential opportunities are there to enhance, for instance, food system resilience. And that's an area where we seek to operationalize more in our work. And the third point that this scenario also points us to is that it's important to be able to sort of utilize a food systems perspective, where you're able to sort of see what's happening in communities, what's happening with farmers, what's happening with indeed agri markets, for instance, but at the same time being able to see the wider picture of how food systems are developed, and also to see how our interventions are fitting within such systems and whether they're indeed enhancing the adaptive capacity of those systems. And those are the three areas that these scenarios really highlight towards. Threats I see are that we are continuing to see silos of humanitarian and development work, also in funding, also in our own operations, while we should be sort of working with interfaces of these kind of interventions, and that's what we should be investing into more. The other aspect, I think also it was referred to one of the chats, is the issue of global inequalities. We should be raising awareness on power differences and the fact that some market concentrations are in the hands of a few powerful players, and we should be tackling those at the same time as that we're tackling local resilience in fragile settings. The third issue that I'm very concerned with, and I think it highlights very strongly in a lot of these scenarios, is the issue of cascading issues in systems that maybe, for instance, organize a realize a vicious sort of cycle in which a combination of conflict, climate change, biodiversity loss, and other issues are sort of compiling the misery, you might say, on low and fragile income settings. And that is what I'm extremely worried about. And I think that's what we should be addressing. So I can hand over to my colleague, Elisa Sapit from Cordate Nepal and our partnership manager in Asia. Elisa, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bram. It's indeed a really honor to be here and to share some of my ideas, also on behalf of Asian Context. I mean, I think a lot of things have been highlighted by colleagues here, by the panelists here, on the context of the vulnerabilities of climate, migration, political unrest. That's very pertinent for Asia. So we're already struggling with issues that are further enhanced by crisis in Ukraine. You can already see, for example, in Nepal, the food prices have gone up by 40 to 50%. The fuel prices have gone up to 80%. So in recent weeks, you have seen that the effect of Ukraine has come to personal lives. So people are not able to say that it's because of Ukraine or anything, but it has come down to really personal, everyday well-being on where do you prioritize? Do you Do you start to look about food or your health or, you know, diversity in food, or do you more prioritize education and health, for instance, in areas where poverty is really widespread? So also in the Asia of context that, you know, we're already impacted by vulnerabilities of climate disasters, you know, political unrest that you have to take care of. And we're just coming out of the pandemic right now. We have seen that during pandemic or during disasters, when the food prices go high, or when the, you know, when the functioning of the local market you know, is deteriorated, it becomes a new normal. It doesn't really come back to the normalcy that was there before. So the consumers are hit from all the end. The rural livelihoods are hit at almost every end, because migration is really high. People are looking for jobs. They lose their livelihoods. They lose all their sources of socioeconomic upliftment. So when I see it, the scenarios, I especially reflect together with my team on scenarios A and C, where, you know, of course, there is escalation of conflict, and there is higher pressure on existing food system. You have food crisis, and although they are contained, the problems continue to go upwards, because we don't have a lot of ways to come back to being resilient. So I think there are a lot of ways that you know, organization like Coordate can work on. Primarily, some of the things that Bram has already reflected on, to look at the local food system, to look more on how can you be more sustainable as a country, as a community locally. So how can you invest on smallholder farmers? How can you invest on local SMEs for that sense to really boost the local market? How can you also look at more investment on the DRR side of it? So, you know, not looking at problems in silos, but more collaborate, you know, public-private partnership, bring in stakeholders who can talk about this together, and to really not reinvent the wheel again and again, but more, you know, work together to contain these issues. I think the, you know, agendas of lobby and advocacy remains crucial, because you also have to push the governments amidst the political unrest to look into more issues of how you be a sustainable nation in itself. It takes time, but I think you have to start one way or the other. We also see that the investment on the awareness side of it is really important, to really work with the communities, to really work with local change makers, for instance, to work with local youth, to give an opportunity on employment, to give a local opportunity of well-being, and to also, you know, stop down the migration a bit, and to find resources in country to really do something. So I feel that these scenarios are very, very important in that sense. You also see sometimes it actually also frustrates you on how you can be a part of the movement that can do something in country and in the region. But I also know that people in this region is extremely resilient. We have had a lot of problems in the past, but you also learn on how resilient people are, how much encouraged they are to come out of this problem and to look at solutions. And I think development agencies, all of us here, the organizers and organizations like Coordate, can really positively, you know, enhance that. And we should do that all together, I think. So I stop here, also looking at the time. Bram, I hope I was able to share some ideas from our region. Thank you.
Thanks, Liza. So we have our third panelist, which is Evans Onyemara. I believe he has disappeared from our panel, but I see an Evans Onyemara in the attendees list. I see he is joining the panel right now. So please, Evans, go ahead and give your reflection as well. Evans, we can't hear you yet. There you are. Go ahead, Evans.
Hello.
Hi, Evans. We can hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right,
please.
thank you very much. Thank you. Let me join Eliza to thank the presenters and especially Bram for the opportunity for us to present the West African perspective, especially coming from the Nigeria context. We have studied the scenarios, and we quite frankly agree that it resonates with our context at the moment. And we have also looked to work with. in our program planning, project planning, and our project management meetings. We have seen that the war affects quite a lot, especially in relation to importation of foods. A lot of foods that we use in Nigeria are imported. And because of the war in Ukraine, a lot of factors have been affected, especially when you talk about the exchange rate, of conversion from naira to dollar. And again, some food items that we import, like fish and wheat, have, and that offers us a threat in the sense that the nutritional values that people get from their food is weakened and is affected invariably. So we have looked at the scenarios, and we also have seen that the opportunities this offers us is that we will continue to do our advocacy, because we are known for, taking very giant strides in the area of advocacy for food supply and growing what we eat in the Nigeria context. So CCN will continue to interface with policymakers to ensure that we generate food locally instead of depending more on imported foods. Some of the threats is that the young people who hitherto had been in Ukraine were moved back to the country, and it adds to the pressure of the number already. We have about something million people in Nigeria. So the influx or the return of these students and youth from Ukraine, poses some threats, and which, if not well harnessed, will encourage or lead to more banditry, because they may be, recruited in one way or the other. And again, another opportunity that it offers us is that we can also tap into their own experiences to improve, because they have been there. For some of them have been there for quite some time. Tapping into their own experiences will help us to improve food systems and also make us to be resilient. So we have looked at the scenarios, and we feel that it is something we can work with, all the time that we have opportunity to plan programs for advocacy and things like that. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I have shared some slides already with Bram in case there is need for us to say more. Having looked at the slides, will also be an opportunity, or it will also be in a position to do so, maybe at a later time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Evans. Thanks for your relevant contribution. Great that you managed to join us in the end. So what we are going to do now is have a short interaction with the audience based on the question. What possible actions can you already take based on this scenario exercise? So from the presentations, I already heard some things like lobby and advocacy, creating new partnerships. This is also helpful to prioritize actions during project planning and management meetings. And I see also that our Mentimeter has already brought a lot of things. So I think with partners, I think that NGOs should prepare by looking for more opportunities to make local markets more stronger, propose alternatives for free trade. So maybe, of course, we will share all these ideas after the meeting. So this will already help you think a little bit about how you can already work based on these scenarios in your own organization. So maybe it is time now to give the floor to some of our participants. Laurie, did you see anything happening in the chat or the Mentimeter which you find is really helpful to bring out a new perspective around these actions that organizations can take?
Yeah, definitely a lot is going on in the chat. Some questions have been answered by Herman or by Just. but there was one question that Herman also indicated would be a good question to ask to the panelists. So I'm just going to read it here. Are organizations facing procurement problems for food assistance, and in which countries particularly? So maybe I'm looking at the input from the organizations that we heard before. If you can answer this question.
From my side, I don't have a specific answer, I think, to give on the procurement issue. What is, of course, definitely a situation is that project budgets which have been identified maybe a year or 2 years previous have come out of date, so they require urgent updating. But we are in discussion with donors indeed to see where the opportunities are there to mitigate that. But I'm afraid I can't give a specific example at this time. Sorry.
No worries, thank you. Yeah, and maybe just also an invitation to put up your hand if you have a question, because we can also open your microphone so that you can ask your question to the panelists yourself.
Well, I see in the chat now that Joan Ishanova says that CARE has a problem or sees a problem. So maybe we can invite Joan to share his view on the question that we had just now. That's, there he is. Well, Joan, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I mean, it's not that much. I mean, I'm Juan Echanove, the Associate Vice President for Food and Water Systems at CARE International. And what we see is WFP, with whom we partner in a number of emergency and fragile contexts, they indeed see already a shortage in supplies of grain and other basic commodities in many of the geographies where they work, and often we partner with them. So we really see that a tremendous challenge. I think that they have already conducted a number of appeals, confirming that in fact, because half of the grain that they were usually purchasing for food aid was coming from Ukraine, and they are basically unable to match the needs. So in many scenarios, they have to basically, you know, make hard decisions in terms of how to focalize their support, since they cannot provide food aid at the same scale they were used to. And then another sort of challenge that we are facing, that more like CARE directly, in many of the contexts where we provide cash or vouchers, the amounts that were sufficient enough, you know, to ensure basic safety nets, they are not enough anymore because of inflation. And we see that in dozens of countries, literally, basically everywhere where we are working. And the same apply, of course, in terms of access to inputs, agricultural inputs that we procure in different programs. I have in mind, for instance, a large program that we have in Malawi currently. So it's all over the place, that inflation and how it impacts our procurement.
Thanks, Joan. So maybe could you add something about the topic we try to focus on? So actually, what actions do you think you can take?
Sure. What we are doing as CARE right now, I mean, we are planning in twofold. I mean, we are stepping up our support in the Horn of Africa and in other very fragile contexts because of the increased needs. But what we are trying to also do is using the window of opportunity still ahead of us, of a few months till the next yield, in certain countries, which are more like basket countries, to directly support small scale farmers to be able to keep producing despite less access to fertilizers, by accelerating our programming in promoting agroecology, efficient use of fertilizers, because we know that traditionally in many places, farmers that use fertilizers overuse that. And also, and I think that's very important, enhancing our work on food loss and waste prevention, because if that has been always important, now it's more important than ever. So of course, our challenge, as I said before, is that I think we only have a few months ahead of us. The way we put it is just to avoid other places to become the Horn, like the Horn of Africa or other places where it's already kind of too late for those kind of larger scale preventive responses. So this is our main focus right now as CARE.
Thanks, Joan. I think that is a really interesting perspective indeed, that you can make sure that countries that are able to produce could keep producing, and that you reduce the food loss and waste. So let's see if we can get another comment from a participant about what actions can you take. I don't see any raised hands yet, but I did see, I think, a remark in the chat by Thomas Lacchio about lobby and advocacy. So maybe you are interested in sharing that a little bit about that comment with us, Thomas. I think we should be able to hear you now.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I'm speaking from Kenya, and particularly we're working in the coast region. This is ADS Pwani. ADS Pwani means Anglican Development Services, and we are working under the Anglican Church, and we're implementing our programs in the whole of coast region. We're actually covering the 6 counties, and we've been here since 1993. So from what I've been discussing the charts, this is a real scenario that you're experiencing here is an organization. And having been here for some time, I think the discussion here resonates with your programs very, very much. And particularly when you talk of the fragile context, most of the counties in the Kenyan coast are actually fragile in terms of accessibility to food and even affordability. You know, when you look at food, we look at 4 different pillars, and that is accessibility, affordability. We also look at availability and the issues of sustainability. So those are the 4 pillars we are trying to work on, even as we try to influence the issues of food production. But when you look at the context of the Kenyan coast, the issues of malnutrition are just amazing here. It's a nightmare. So when you talk of a food system that has been affected due to the ongoing war, we are looking towards communities that are not able to actually eat 3 times a day, and they are able to access maybe 1 meal per day. And that means that they might miss out on the most important dietary components. And what we are doing going into the future, we want to program towards what we are calling nutrition sensitive interventions. So nutrition sensitive intervention means that production here in the Kenyan coast is not just production. We are looking towards farmers being able to produce crops and foods that are able to meet dietary needs, so that even if they are not able to access as much, whatever they are accessing from where they are is able to provide the nutrition components that is required in their bodies. So the other thing that probably we are looking at here, and I had the concern about procurement. We are not directly affected by procurement due to the ongoing challenges, but you're working with a partner, Church World Service. I think some of us might have heard about them. They are doing food aid in the Kenyan coast, and I heard from them that they have been having challenges accessing food in the market to support some of these communities. And you see, if they are not able to access food from the market, it means that the situation becomes even more difficult for the communities. And the reason why they are not accessing is mostly because of the issues of corruption that have taken this country to far-reaching consequences. And you realize that some of these people would even want to hoard food. They want to keep it away from the community so that they are able to hike prices. And sometimes you're talking about inaccessibility, not that the food is not there. There are some cartel, there are some communities, there are some people in the country who want to make sure that they punish others and take full advantage of this opportunity, so that those people who want to buy this food for the communities, they're not able to access it until they meet maybe the prices. Of course, the prices will be exorbitant, they will be hiked. And so Church World Service have been having challenge with that, because some of the budgets you are working with are actually limited budgets. So any effects on maybe the prices have been hiked, it limits you in terms of how much you are able to support these communities. So that is what I'm able to share for now. But of course, we have a lot, and we'll keep this discussion going on beyond this session, so that you get to understand how all these scenarios are affecting us, even from here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Thomas. I've seen a comment also by, I think it is Marina de Paiva, who's been mentioning some things in the chat already. Before we close, maybe you can just have a comment on very shortly, because we need to end this webinar as well to respect everybody's time. But you know, you've been working with market actors, making the markets work, traders, etc. Do you see the same challenge that Thomas's partner is seeing, and how do you see an opportunity to actually deal with that?
Yeah, no, certainly. Thank you, Ryan. Like, I just would like to echo what the colleagues has been sharing. This has been quite a big problem, especially like on the markets. Like, we have a lot of examples, but for example, in Nigeria, there is also the other element that we have a lot of people on the move, and the cash that people receive was spent quite quickly and basically wasn't enough. There's little cash that's been committed to the humanitarian aid spectrum. And we believe that having the possibilities of more development and humanitarian funds, it's quite an important element of this work. So how can we make the development funds more flexible to be also humanitarian the other way around? So to look for local alternatives also as a great opportunity to reinforce better these markets, these local markets, and see how we can approach. I really thank you today, because it has been really insightful to have the paper, but also the discussion. So I need to leave, but I would like to say that we are really interested to keep on engaging and discussing with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marina, for that comment. Actually, I think the flexibility aspect is quite important, and we have in the recent past, doing a project on that. So while we close, I will share a link about that in the chat. Some of the groups that are here have also participated. Sorry for everybody that still wanted to comment, but we have to respect the time of the webinar. I think we've heard some very interesting perspectives. In the Mentimeter, there's a lot of action perspectives here. I heard lobbying and advocacy, creating new partnerships, you know, using the insights from these scenarios during project management and planning meetings. Also the food baskets, yeah, you know, make sure that people keep producing and that food that is not lost to reduce food loss and waste. And I think looking into that flexible interaction between humanitarian and development funding, I think is also a great perspective. So there was one little slot for Herman to comment as well on some of the learning questions that actually he heard to continue this work on the basis of this discussion. So Herman, please give us your final comments before we close.
Thank you, Royan. Yeah, from what I hear you saying and what you've been writing in the chat, I see there's lots of outstanding questions and also lots of potential to see how we can further and make more explicit some of the messages that we would want to advocate on together. And some of them are really also informed by the local level action that some of you are describing that are happening, like Evans and what Thomas has been sharing and Eliza. But there's also been some comments on how to link this to some of the larger narratives about how we influence trade policies. I see that Guus and also Nicole have responded to that. So we're currently thinking about, you know, what could be a relevant next step to take. And if you're willing to be part of that conversation, please reach out also to Royan and Peter and also others in this call, because we're really looking at how to, you know, see what we can do more to ensure that we're prepared for some of these scenarios. Thank you, Royan.
Thanks, Herman. So then it's time to close and thank everybody. I see the final comment by Madelon made it into the chat on the importance of nutrition-sensitive interventions. I'd like to thank everybody. I'll just go ahead and thank everybody that participated in this, the creation of these scenarios, which have been coordinated. KUNO, WUR, Kerk in Actie, the Hunger Project, Oxfam Novit, Save the Children, Action Aid, Fortendaad, and ZOA. And also our panelists today, which you all know, but especially our guests, I guess, Evans and Eliza, who came as a new participants today. But also, of course, the insights from Just, Herman, and Bram. So we will keep you up to date on what is happening. The session has been recorded. We will share a short video of that. And we will also share the outcome of the Mentimeter inputs. And basically, we will be in touch. And let's make sure that we keep this momentum momentum going. Thank you, everybody.